I was looking on your website and I had a few questions I wanted to ask you,
Sure.
just to get some more information and background. So I noticed that there are some aided and unaided AAC devices. Could you explain the differences between those?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So when we talk about aided AAC, it's those things that are external to us, things that we may carry with us, okay? But it can be on this range from non-electronic to electronic.
Okay.
So as an example, you'll see this display back here of several different what we call speech generated devices. So these are the electronic devices. And you can tell how they have handles, they may have straps. They're things that we carry with us. They can also sit on what's called a wheelchair mount. So there's like a holder for these devices that can hook onto a wheelchair or a table. There's different things like that. But also we have non-electronic aided. So again, this is the Pixie Pal, and this is a really nice setup that the inventors created. But this too is aided because we carry it with us.
Okay.
It just is non-electronic. So this, you could throw this in a bathtub or in a pool, but it has the same words, the same important words that are on these devices. It's just a smaller number of words that fit inside this particular container. But this is kind of a cool little thing. So that's aided, non-electronic, right? And then we have things like these, which are paper-based, non-electronic, but it's also aided because this requires a communication partner to hold it up in front of a person who has complex communication needs. And the communication partner would be pointing to these at a different speed and looking for confirmation from the other person to tell me that's the thing they want. So these kinds of things, this in particular has 9 pages, so there's 36 words represented on here. And this is primarily for a partner-assisted scanning technique, which is a different thing we could talk about actually later on. Other aided communication, actually these are also aided communication. These are tactual symbols that represent the same words that I just showed you over here. Okay. So these tactual symbols were invented, I guess is the word, or by the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies. And what they do is they used a 3D printer to represent words that can be held and felt and used for communication by people who are blind or visually impaired. So these are tactual symbols that represent individual words. And you can go to the project-core.com website and you'll be able to download for free what's called STL files. And STL files are for a 3D printer. So anybody in the world, if they want to try these aided AAC systems, they can go on that website and look to see how to do that.
And from there, they would bring those files to somebody with a 3D printer?
Correct.
Okay.
Right, so you could find, in Vermont, we had one 3D printer for free that was in the center of Vermont, and so we could download those STL files there, and they would print them out. They'd print out a set. These in particular were used by a local 3D printer called Moonshot, and they have a new 3D printer which uses injection molding.
Oh.
And what's really great about that is that it provides the ability to print in a lot of detail. And so if someone is holding this who's visually impaired, you have raised elements of braille that represents the word, and then you also have the textures along the edge and these raised elements on top. And so these pieces need to be really well represented and clear so that a person can feel these very well. And then these little holes can be, well, in case somebody tries to swallow something that's actually smaller, that they'll be able to have an air hole, but also you can put these on a necklace.
Wow.
So there's different ways to make these available to people. But yeah, the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies were the ones that developed these 3D tactile symbols.
That's great.
Yeah.
These are all wonderful. Okay, another question I had. What are the different kinds of technological AAC devices, and could you explain the differences between them?
Yeah, so we've come a long way since the 1970s. In the 1980s, I was able to play with, work with. One of the first speech generating devices, and that was a Prankiromic device, Prankiromic company. And so that took the place of typewriters, electronic typewriters. And so what that offered was a different way to represent language that was much more efficient and effective for, say, a person who couldn't use their fingers to touch a button, right? So if you can't physically type and you have physical challenges, but let's say you can wear a headband that has a head stick on it, and maybe you can point to pictures, right? Or even point to something like this using a head stick, and that allows the person to directly select a letter, but use a body part that works.
Okay.
But what these devices allowed, and so these are now called, the more modern devices are what's called multifunctional. Multifunctional, I think, replaces the word high tech because it's much more descriptive of what they do, right? So the more modern electronic devices, and you'll see them well represented here, offer, again, multifunctional, which means I can access a keyboard, right, in different ways. It can be a QWERTY keyboard, or it could be an alphabetic keyboard. It also allows the person to communicate with pictures we call graphic symbols. And these are for the people who can't read yet. Okay, so on one device, you could have graphic symbols for people who can't read yet. We call those people who are pre-literate. You have symbols for people who are just learning language. We call that pre-symbolic or early symbolic, of just learning language. Then you also have the ability to spell and write and learn how to do that and participate in school. But you also have these really cool functions that allow you to text, right? So everybody's used to texting now. So what you can do with these devices is that you can basically hit a particular button and you can send the message that comes up here to a phone number.
Wow.
So this becomes like a giant texting device,
That's
right?
great.
And so there are people who use AAC around the world who communicate with each other through Facebook Messenger, for example, right? So they compose their message, they hit a button, that message goes to Facebook Messenger, and now you can participate with people around the world. So that's through social media. So most of these devices now can print things out, just your typical print, and they can send messages electronically, right, to social media or to text. You can make phone calls and things like that. The other reason it makes many of these multifunctional is that they have what's called environmental control.
Okay.
And what that means is that you can switch to a page on here that says, close my window shades, or open my door, or turn on my music, or it might be, hey Alexa, right? So you can actually access many of the things that we have currently that make our lives easier via these devices.
Wow, okay, that's great. And do these come preloaded with these abilities? Is that somewhere you have to go and seek that out and say, hey, I need these certain functions to help me with my daily life, or how does that work?
Typically, they all are part of it now, and that technology is largely driven by people who are working for these companies who use AAC systems.
Wow.
Right? So they're said, no, wait a minute. If you're going to make this device, you better make it so it's accessible so I can text. You better make sure that I can access social media. You better make sure that I can, hit a button to speak to Alexa or to an Echo device that's going to control different things electronically within my environment, right?
Wow.
So that, market is primarily driven by people who need this type of technology, right?
That's great. Talk about accessibility.
Yeah, it's really cool.
All right. Another question I had is, who is eligible to receive one of these devices? Could someone off the street get it? Do you need a prescription? How does that work?
Right, so in large part, eligibility is a term that is used mainly still for the insurance companies, okay? Because all of these devices, from an insurance company standpoint, are considered durable medical equipment, right? Just like a cane or a wheelchair or something. So when a speech language pathologist does an evaluation, the SLP should get information from the family, from the person who may be needing it, from teachers, about what kinds of things do they need, right, to fully participate. Let's say they're in school, and so they need a device to fully participate in their academic curriculum, right? Not just for talking, but for writing, right? To learn how to spell, to learn how to complete their schoolwork, learn how to participate in class, right? So there's an academic need for these devices, but they're also, if they bring that home, there's also that need to talk to mom and dad, sharing their thoughts, tell them what they need. Maybe there's a medical emergency they want to complete, right? So each of these devices is associated with what's called a code that insurance companies want to have documented to pay for something. So wheelchairs have a code, canes have a code, that kind of thing. So speech generating devices, which is what insurance companies, and that's both private and public, recognize is a particular code. So if the person needs a device for sort of a broad range of reasons, which is what I just talked about, both school and home, then you look at a device that would be capable of allowing that person to communicate in those various contexts, right? And so these days, most people need to have multifunctional devices, right? And so these come with a code, and so the speech pathologist comes in and evaluates for a particular device. And then on that evaluation, you're recommending a particular one because of the features that might best match that person's capabilities, right? And then once that evaluation is done, it's submitted to the vendors for these devices. And the vendors are great now because they double check the evaluation. They say, oh, I think you need to say something more about this, or the insurance company is going to ask you to make sure you have this component of your evaluation. And that's really super helpful. I mean, most vendors are really, and they're manufacturers of the devices, right? And by the way, many of the people who work for these vendors are also speech pathologists. Right? And they've chosen to work for the companies, and so they understand both the clinical standpoint and the marketing and the the components of the devices that make it a really good evaluation, right? And so once an evaluation is completed and the vendors, for particular devices checked it out and it has the right code, then it gets sent to the insurance company. And then the family, their job, if they have the insurance, is to make sure there's a physician's prescription. Because you have to have the speech paths report, and then you also have to have the doctor's prescription. Because if these are considered durable medical equipment, in the insurance mind, it's replacing a non-functional body part, right? And so a physician's prescription is required for these types of devices. But that can be done, right? That's all part of the process that you have to do. Now, in some schools, they actually have devices that the school has purchased, right? And so maybe devices are available for students to try out. I mean, pretty much every school has iPads now, right? But, and iPads, they're hybrid devices. They're hybrids because now they're more multifunctional than ever, right? You can access different communication applications on them, but it also opens up the door to assistive technology tools. So things like being able to access the internet and being able to pull off the text from the internet and to simplify the vocabulary that child might be exposed to, so that the child can understand what they're reading, because now this application, through its smart technology, has figured out how to translate those words into either language or form that the student can understand. So there's a lot of this interfacing now that happens, right? So yeah, I mean, iPads, they have all kinds of access now. So even if you go into accessibility features, just on the iPad, you can select, I want switch, right? This is a switch, so alternative access. So if the person can't touch buttons on the iPad, you can have interfaces that plug into the device, and a switch can plug into it. Or you have Bluetooth, so that's a wireless connection, right? But then there's also wireless. So you can have joysticks that connect to an iPad or device. You can have, I have a gyroscopic mouse. Let me just open up show that, that's kind of cool too. Oh, so this is an interface, for example, to the iPad.
Okay.
So this gets plugged into the iPad here, this gets plugged into, you know, a particular device. You can plug a switch like that into this, and now you have a wired connection to the iPad.
Wow.
Right? But Bluetooth is wonderful. So, you know, there's, here it is. You can have, this is called a Koha, or Kuha, I'm not sure actually how you pronounce it. But basically this has a wireless connector, and you basically set it on here, and you pair it, right? Just like you would anything else. You pair it with your device, and now you've got a head mouse.
Wow.
So the cursor shows up on the buttons just by head movement.
Oh my, that is wonderful. Wow.
And there's also eye gaze, right? So if you're not successful with head mouse, you can't move your head. Let's say you can't move your head, right? And you can't touch buttons, but your eyes move well. So many of these devices have what's called eye gaze functions. So you can order the model, you can try out the model that accepts eye gaze. There's also, I have a laptop over there which has an eye gaze plug-in. So you plug it into the USB and you access the eye gaze software on the laptop.
Wow.
So now your laptop, right, can become your eye gaze communication system.
So are a lot of devices that aren't labeled as AAC devices, just like a regular laptop, they can become more accessible with different add-ons?
Yeah, and that's what's so beautiful now, right? Is that we have applications that work with Windows or work with Mac. So these are what are termed dedicated devices.
Okay.
However, I can turn off that page, I can exit, and now I'm on the internet. So, so this runs on, you can see it's Samsung, right? So that runs on like an Android device, okay? This is kind of its own device, but you can still access the internet with it. This is a Tobii Dynavox, and it has a variety of applications, but if you needed to get on the internet, you can still hook into the internet. So this is what I mean by multifunctional, right? Every person has the right to access information in a variety of ways.
Definitely.
And there's just too much to learn in this world without having that access.
Yeah.
So that's what manufacturers are really figuring out, right? So that's why we talk about multifunctional, not just communication, but access to the internet, so I can learn, so I can communicate with others.
So because so many people have different abilities, is there a certain age or developmental stage a person should be at before being introduced to technological AAC? Should you start with non-technological AAC? How does that process work?
Well, years ago, we thought there was a hierarchy. So years ago, we thought that you had to move people through this continuum. So for example, you might show a picture of you might have an object of a glass, and then you might have an object of something else, right? And so there was all this stuff that went into, well, they need to be able to point to and match the object to a picture. And they have to go through this whole continuum to make sure they do picture matching to object matching. And then if I say a word, then they have to identify a picture of it. There's no evidence behind that anymore, okay? What we have found, and we have pretty solid evidence now, is the most important thing is to give access to the person who needs the language, a large vocabulary. So they need to have access to language, okay? So my youngest client was 15 months who was using a device like this.
Wow.
Okay, because she could actually access, she had little teeny fingers, right? But she had significant, we don't say nonverbal, but she had significant complex communication needs, right? So she couldn't speak in a conventional way, but her little fingers worked, and she really needed to transmit messages. So the whole point was, well, how can I teach this little kid who at 15 months needs to start learning language? What can I give this little child to teach her how to link words? What words are important to say so that she can start learning how to transmit a message, to mom and dad or whomever. So yeah, little fingers can access the buttons which represent language, right? So that's really the key. All of these, they're tools to access language, right? And how that language is represented on these different systems is something that we're still figuring out. But what we do know is that you want children as soon as possible to have access to language in an alternative way if they can't speak it, so they begin to figure out how words go together, how words are combined so I can express myself, right? So we no longer think about readiness skills. What we're saying is get those children access to language as quickly as possible, and let the tool be that which allows us to teach the language, right? Because we don't want these kids to be left behind. And frankly, there are more problems if you have this, and that's not really a mentality, but if you wait too long and you keep thinking, well, I'm gonna wait for this kid to talk, I'm gonna wait. What happens is you never actually teach that child how to socially communicate. Okay. So we're humans, we're social beings, and we need to learn how to communicate beyond the multimodality, which is we all communicate through facial expression, we communicate through our hands, right? Through our body language, through our paralinguistics, how intense we are with our voice, all these things. But when people, and it could be children or adults, have difficulty with that type of expression, or they can't produce speech that's intelligible for other people to understand, they still need to have access to words in many, many different forms and ways to begin to figure out, well, how do I combine these words to get my message across? And it's not just basic needs. People have to start thinking, going beyond. These tools just aren't for basic needs and wants. They're not, right? Everybody has a right to communicate a thought, to say no, right? Develop this self-determination and autonomy. Every person has a right to tell what they like or don't like, where they want to go, where they don't want to go, right? So how do we give them the tools and the words to do that? Well, either you're an aided system, or if right now we're kind of in the middle of figuring out a speech generating device, then we don't wait. We start right away and we point to the words and we show them in visual language how to link these words to create and express language. So there is no waiting anymore. We start teaching language right away, just as you would with a baby.
Yeah, it's important to provide those opportunities. So like you're saying, people need help learning how to use these devices, how to go about that. I've heard of facilitated communication and a lot of controversy with that, especially with hand-over-hand assistance. Could you explain more on that?
So facilitated communication, I'll point people first to the American Speech Language and Hearing Association, to that website, because this was a procedure or a way to help people communicate that was under a lot of discussion back in the 80s is primarily when it was started, okay? So I'm an alum of Syracuse University, and when I was there, the dean, Dr. Douglas Bicklin, a very well-respected dean, he had figured out there was this way that he could maybe help people communicate using this technique called facilitated communication. And I don't want to go into a long detail because there's a lot of information to talk about with that. But there were disadvantages and advantages of that technique. The advantage is that many of the people that Dr. Bicklin worked with and some of his proteges was that it was getting people to communicate for the first time who had never been introduced to any aided AAC.
Wow.
Okay, so the intent was, gosh, I got this group of individuals who have not been successful to communicate in other ways, so let's figure out how to do that, right? And so families got on board. There are still speech pathologists and educators, all around the country who say they're specialists in facilitated communication. So that is very, very different in technique, strategy, and evidence. It's a very different way of assisting a person communicate than augmentative and alternative communication. Okay, so AAC has tools in place and strategies to support a person learning language, okay? And facilitated communication is I'd say a separate, different way of working with a person who can't speak in conventional ways that doesn't have the evidence behind it. So you'll go to, like, ASHA has very distinct rules about why we're not going to condone, I guess is the word for it, facilitated communication. So a piece of facilitated, though, that I'm going to talk a little bit about here, which is I still think merits some further discussion, and it's something that other academics have talked about and thought carefully about. But there is a part of facilitated which is to help a person access, or you're thinking you're going to help a person access. Let's say the person has a severe apraxia, which is a motor planning problem, and they can see what's in front of them, but they can't initiate the motor movement to actually get there. Whatever's going on neurologically, they have a really hard time initiating that movement, okay? So the thought was, well, if we provide these prompts, and prompts that should be faded, so maybe I'm gonna do hand over hand and I'm gonna help them to that area, and we're gonna do that several times until they have memorized where to go. And then I'm gonna release it and go to a different area of the body. And then, so I'm gonna move from direct hand over hand to this, to this, to this, to where I may just be standing next to the person. And that in some way, we still don't understand how or why, that just by having a facilitator close by, it assists the person to point to the buttons.
Wow.
Okay? But there's a lot of controversy, because anytime that you put your hand over somebody else's, you're potentially controlling, even without your knowledge, even without your conscious awareness, that by putting your hand on top of somebody else's and guiding them to a point, it's not really the person. It's the facilitator.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's one controversy, right? You're not building autonomy, you're not supporting a person's independent point, because a person may get dependent on that hand over hand.
Yeah.
And if you never allow that person to be separate than you, then you're not helping that person to communicate independently, right? And let's say the person always has the trouble with pointing, but maybe their eyes work. So if you're so focused on helping that person directly select with their hands, yet in reality they might be more accurate with direct selection with their eyes, then you should allow and teach them independent access with their eyes instead of their hands. Okay, so you want to, as much as you can, limit, as a communication partner, any direct contact with the person. So let me tell you where the problems with hand over hand lie, okay? In the research that I'm involved in, and in research that I was previously involved in, and from many years, almost 28 years of practice, the problem is when you have individuals, let's say especially with autism, who are in classrooms, and let's say there's an arts and crafts activity going on. And so there's an instructional aid next to the person with autism, and there's a device somewhere near, or there's pictures like this. And the art teacher says, okay, time to put the glue on the paper, or time to stick this thing on this thing. And so what happens is that the person with autism is sitting there looking, but now you have an aide who goes over and puts their hand on top of that person and does the work. Hand over hand, let's put the glue on. Hand over hand, let's hold the marker. Here, let's write. Hand over hand, and let's write. So you never give the person the opportunity to access those tools on their own. And if they can't literally do this, then the thinking should be, well, how can I get the person to do this same thing, maybe in a different way, right? Or maybe be a part of the activity in a different way.
Yeah.
So there's too much hand over hand going on, okay? And it takes away that person's autonomy, and it can be a violation of their personal space. So I want people to think carefully of, just imagine if that was you, right? And you're sitting in the classroom, and instead of being given the time to reach for a marker and to just scribble and learn how to write, you always have somebody's hands on top of yours doing the work for you. So this becomes enabling and not teaching. And then you have to ask yourself, well, is the most important thing here getting this product made? Is the most important thing getting this picture made by the end of class so that product becomes more important than teaching the person the process, teaching the person, why are we doing this? And maybe it's better to teach the person to talk about what's going on versus getting so wrapped up on getting this product done, okay? So there's a lot of things to consider that, but it is now pretty well determined that you need to not be doing a lot of hand over hand, right? Give the person their personal space. Don't take over something. It's not about the product, it's about the process.
Yeah.
And then it also allows you to step back and think, oh gosh, this person I've been doing hand over hand with a marker and helping them print, but nobody's ever actually taught them how to write. No one's ever actually taught them how to spell words. But maybe the spelling is going to come through a keyboard like this versus having to handwrite, right?
Yeah.
So then you can go to this developmental writing technique that definitely occurs. So that's the recommendation in our AAC world, is as much as possible, unless there's really good reasons to do it, but to avoid your hand over hand support, because it's not helping the person in the long run. It's an invasion of personal space.
Yeah. Wow, that's great. Well, this has been very informative. Thank you very much, Dr. Davidson.
Sure.
I'm sure I'll have many more questions.
Oh, glad to have you.
Thank you. Well, you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Alyssa.